For most of modern Russian military planning, geography has been more than a map. It has been a weapon. Russia is enormous. Its most important military and industrial facilities do not have to sit near the battlefield. Oil refineries, fuel depots, transportation hubs, factories and command facilities can be distributed across thousands of kilometers of territory. That creates something military planners call strategic depth. The idea is simple. If the enemy can destroy what is close to the front, move the important things farther away. If a logistics hub becomes vulnerable, relocate it. If a factory is threatened, build another facility deeper inside the country. If an army loses territory, retreat into a larger geographic space and continue fighting. Distance buys time, and time allows a state to repair, replace, and reorganize. For Russia, that advantage is unusually large. Ukraine shares a long land border with Russia, but the Russian state extends vastly farther east. The distance from Ukraine to some of Russia's most important industrial centers is measured not in hundreds, but in thousands of kilometers. For decades, that geography made a basic military assumption seem almost self-evident. There would always be a rear. The front might be dangerous. The border might be dangerous. But deep inside Russia, the war should become someone else's problem. That assumption is becoming harder to maintain. In July 2026, Ukrainian strikes reached Russian energy and logistics infrastructure far beyond the immediate battlefield. Ukraine also intensified attacks against transportation routes, fuel infrastructure and maritime supply routes connected to occupied Crimea. Analysts at the Institute for the Study of War assessed that Russia's enormous territory itself was increasingly becoming a defensive problem because Moscow does not have enough conventional air defense resources to protect every important facility across such a vast area. And this creates a paradox. The same geography that protects Russia can also create more things that Russia has to protect. A country the size of Russia does not merely have more space. It has more infrastructure, more railways, more pipelines, more refineries, more power stations, more warehouses, more ports, more fuel terminals, more factories, more possible routes. And every one of those systems exists for a reason. They are connected. A refinery does not matter simply because it produces fuel. It matters because fuel has to move from that refinery to somewhere else. A railway does not matter simply because trains use it. It matters because those trains connect factories, depots, ports, and armies. A port does not matter simply because ships can dock there. It matters because those ships can move the resources that another part of the system needs. This is why the significance of Ukraine's long-range strike campaign cannot be measured simply by counting explosions. A refinery destroyed in isolation is one thing. A refinery destroyed when several other refineries are already operating under pressure is something else. A ferry destroyed in isolation is one thing. A ferry destroyed after rail and road connections to Crimea have already been disrupted is something else. And a tanker attacked in isolation is one thing. A tanker attacked after Russia has shifted more of its fuel supply onto maritime routes is something else entirely. The target is no longer just the object. The target is the dependency. That distinction is becoming increasingly important in the war. By July, Ukrainian forces were conducting a sustained campaign against the logistics architecture supporting occupied Crimea. Critical threats assessed that Ukrainian strikes were hitting roads, railways, bridges, ferries, fuel tankers, ports, and energy infrastructure in an effort to make Russian resupply to the peninsula increasingly difficult. And Russia was responding. That is important, because this is not a story in which Ukraine strikes something and Russia simply watches it disappear. Russia repairs. Russia reroutes. Russia disperses. Russia adds protection. Russia moves supplies onto alternative routes. And then Ukraine looks for the new weak point. That creates the central problem of this entire video. Can Ukraine make Russia spend more and more resources simply to preserve the same level of military capability? Because if the answer is yes, strategic depth begins to change meaning. The rear is still there. The territory is still enormous. The factories have not disappeared. The refineries have not all stopped. The Russian state has not collapsed. But the price of keeping that enormous system functioning may be rising. And that is a very different question from whether Ukraine can destroy Russia's war machine outright. The first objective is much harder. The second may be considerably more realistic. To understand why, we have to stop looking at the Russian rear as a collection of isolated targets. We have to look at it as a system, because the real battlefield may no longer end where the front line ends. It may extend all the way to the infrastructure that allows the front line to function. And once that happens, Russia's greatest geographic advantage creates a problem of its own. The farther the war reaches, the more of Russia has to be defended. There is a problem with looking at a war only through the map. A map tells you who controls a village. It tells you where a front line moved. It tells you which city is being attacked. But it does not necessarily tell you whether the military system behind that front line is becoming stronger or weaker. And by the summer of 2026, that distinction had become increasingly important in Ukraine. The ground war remained brutally attritional. Russia continued trying to advance. Ukraine continued trying to hold, counterattack, and exploit weaknesses. But neither side had produced the kind of rapid breakthrough that would suddenly transform the entire battlefield. That created a strategic problem. If moving the front line became extremely expensive, what else could a military do? One answer was to attack deeper, not necessarily to capture territory, but to attack the infrastructure that makes territory defensible. This is where long-range strike warfare becomes more than a collection of dramatic explosions. The basic logic is straightforward. An army at the front requires ammunition. Ammunition requires factories. Factories require electricity, machinery, and raw materials. Armies require fuel. Fuel requires refineries, storage facilities, and transportation. Transportation requires roads, railways, ports, and bridges. And all of those systems require protection. So the battlefield is not simply the place where soldiers are fighting. It is an enormous network extending behind them. Ukraine's long-range campaign increasingly attempts to reach that network. Recent reporting shows just how far this campaign has developed. Ukrainian drones have struck Russian energy infrastructure thousands of kilometers from Ukraine, while Russian refineries and export terminals have experienced repeated disruption. By August, Reuters reported that Russian seaborne oil product exports in July had fallen by roughly one-third from June and more than half from the same month of 2025, with industry sources attributing much of the disruption to refinery damage and unplanned maintenance following Ukrainian strikes. But that statistic needs to be understood correctly. A reduction in exports does not automatically mean an equivalent reduction in Russia's ability to wage war. Russia can redirect supplies, can use spare capacity, can import certain products, can restrict exports, it can change transportation patterns, and it can repair damaged facilities. That is why the important question is not, how much did Ukraine destroy? The more useful question is, how much did Russia have to change because Ukraine destroyed it? That difference is crucial. Imagine a refinery that normally produces a certain amount of fuel. A drone damages it. If engineers repair the facility quickly and production returns to normal, the strategic effect may be limited. But suppose the repair takes weeks. Russia then has to increase output somewhere else. That facility operates closer to its maximum capacity. Fuel has to travel farther. Trucks pay more. Railways become more important. Exports are restricted. Prices rise. And another Ukrainian strike arrives before the system has completely recovered. Now the original explosion has become something much larger. Not because the explosion itself was enormous, because it interacted with the rest of the system. That distinction is becoming visible in Russia's transport economy. Reuters reported in August that fuel prices had risen sharply in parts of Russia after the refinery strikes, while trucking companies faced higher operating costs and some were reducing the distance they could economically serve. Freight rates also increased substantially during the most acute phase of the July fuel shortage. This is the kind of second-order effect that matters. A refinery is not just a refinery. It is connected to transportation. Transportation is connected to commerce. Commerce is connected to prices. And prices are connected to the resources available to the state and the population. The same logic appears in Crimea. Crimea is geographically connected to Russia, but geography alone does not guarantee reliable military supply. The peninsula needs food, fuel, ammunition, spare parts, personnel, electricity, and military equipment. Those things must cross specific routes. That creates choke points. And choke points are valuable because a military does not need to destroy everything. It only needs to make enough of the network unreliable. Ukraine's current campaign in Crimea illustrates this approach. In August, the commander of Ukraine's unmanned systems forces, Robert Magyarbrovdy, described attacks on railways, oil depots, power infrastructure, and air defense systems as part of a broader effort to make Crimea less useful as a Russian military base. AP reported that Russia was responding by increasing drone deployments and using jamming and other countermeasures. Again, the important word is not destruction. It is function. A railway does not have to disappear permanently to become a military problem. It only has to become unreliable enough that planners must account for its vulnerability. A fuel depot does not have to be destroyed forever. It only has to force supplies onto another route. A A port does not have to close permanently. It only has to become dangerous enough that insurance costs rise, shipping slows, or additional protection becomes necessary. And that leads to the next stage of the problem. Because every time Russia adapts to one vulnerability, it creates another question. Where does the replacement system become vulnerable? Russia can move fuel by sea, but then the tanker becomes part of the logistics chain. Russia can protect the tanker, but protection requires resources. Russia can add nets, barriers, and anti-drone equipment. But those defenses have to be deployed across enormous distances. Recent reporting has shown Russian tankers and port infrastructure receiving improvised anti-drone protection as attacks on Black Sea energy infrastructure intensified. At the same time, disruptions around major Russian Black Sea terminals have already affected oil flows and international buyers. This is the deeper transformation. The war is no longer only asking, who controls this piece of territory? It is increasingly asking, who can keep the entire network behind that territory functioning under continuous attack? And once that becomes the question, Russia's strategic depth begins to acquire a second meaning. It still provides protection, but it also creates an enormous surface area, an enormous number of routes, an enormous number of facilities, an enormous number of dependencies, and Ukraine does not have to destroy all of them. It only has to keep finding the ones that matter. That is why the next phase of this story is not really about drones. It is about fuel. Because fuel is where a strike against infrastructure begins to collide directly with the everyday functioning of an entire country. Fuel is where the abstract idea of strategic depth becomes tangible. A refinery can sit hundreds or even thousands of kilometers from the front. It can look like an economic target rather than a military one. But fuel is one of the things that connects almost every part of a modern war. Tanks need it, trucks need it, aircraft need it, generators need it, agriculture needs it, civilian transportation needs it, and the military does not simply need fuel to exist. It needs fuel in the right place at the right time in sufficient quantities. That is why a refinery strike matters only when we follow the chain beyond the refinery itself. Russia has a huge oil industry and remains one of the world's major energy producers. That gives Moscow substantial resilience. A damaged refinery does not automatically create a national crisis. Other refineries can increase production. Stocks can be redirected. Fuel can be moved between regions. Imports can fill some gaps. The government can restrict exports and prioritize domestic consumption. And Russia has repeatedly used exactly these kinds of measures. But resilience is not the same thing as immunity. In 2026, Ukraine has increasingly targeted the refining side of Russia's energy system. The objective is not simply to eliminate Russian oil production. It is to interfere with the much more complicated process of turning crude oil into usable products and then distributing those products throughout the country. That distinction is critical. Russia can still produce crude oil, but crude oil sitting in the ground is not gasoline sitting at a filling station. Between the two are refineries, pipelines, storage facilities, railways, terminals, and distribution networks. Strike enough nodes in that chain, and the problem begins to move. It moves from the industrial facility to the transport system, from the transport system to the regional market, and eventually from the regional market to ordinary consumers. That is exactly what has been happening. Reuters reported on August 13th that Russian seaborne oil product exports in July fell 33.3% from June and 54.7% from July 2025, reaching about 3.93 million metric tons. Industry sources linked the decline to unplanned refinery maintenance after repeated Ukrainian drone strikes. Those numbers are significant, but they need context. They do not mean Russian oil production fell by the same percentage. They do not mean Russia suddenly ran out of fuel. And they do not prove that the Russian military was deprived of the fuel it needed. What they show is something more precise. The normal flow of petroleum products through the Russian system was being disrupted. And disruption is the point. Consider what happens when one refinery goes offline. At first, the problem belongs to the refinery. Then another facility has to compensate. If another refinery is already operating near capacity, it has less room to absorb the additional demand. Fuel has to travel farther. Rail capacity becomes more valuable. Trucking costs rise. Regional shortages become more likely. The government intervenes. Exports are restricted. And suddenly a problem that began several hundred kilometers from the battlefield has become a problem for a completely different part of the economy. That is why the Orsk refinery strike in August is particularly revealing. After a Ukrainian drone attack, the refinery was shut down completely, according to the regional governor. The facility processes around 6 million metric tons of crude annually and produces gasoline, diesel, aviation fuel, and other petroleum products. The governor said repairs could take as long as 6 months because key equipment was imported and sanctions complicated replacement. At the time, only about 80% of the region's filling stations were reportedly operating. Again, the important point is not that one refinery was destroyed. It is the repair problem. If a damaged component can be replaced in days, the strike becomes a temporary interruption. If replacement equipment is difficult to obtain and the facility remains offline for months, the same physical damage becomes much more consequential. This is where sanctions, supply chains, and military strikes begin interacting. A drone does not need to destroy an entire refinery. It may only need to damage the component that takes months to replace. That creates a completely different calculation. The attacker spends a relatively inexpensive weapon. The defender may have to spend months of industrial capacity repairing the consequences. And while that repair is taking place, other facilities have to compensate. That is the beginning of the adaptation trap. Russia responds. It imports fuel. It moves fuel from one region to another. It restricts exports. It asks functioning refineries to produce more. It prioritizes emergency services. All of these actions reduce the immediate damage, but they also consume resources, and sometimes they simply transfer the pressure somewhere else. That is why the Russian government's decision to restrict fuel exports matters. It is a rational response. If domestic supply becomes more important, Moscow can sacrifice some foreign sales to stabilize the internal market. But that means the system is making a trade. It is choosing domestic resilience over some export revenue. And if the disruption persists, those choices accumulate. By August, Reuters reported that Russia had extended restrictions on gasoline and diesel exports into 2027 as attacks and refinery disruptions continued to pressure the domestic fuel market. This is not evidence that the Russian economy is collapsing. It is evidence that the state is actively managing a stress system. And that distinction matters. A system under stress can remain functional for a long time. In fact, the ability to absorb shocks is one of Russia's major advantages. But there is another side to resilience. Every alternative requires something. More transportation, more storage, more security, more time, more money, more coordination. And that brings us back to the original question. What does Ukraine actually gain from attacking a refinery? Not necessarily the permanent destruction of the refinery. The larger objective is to force Russia to spend resources restoring the connections that refinery provided. That is a different form of warfare. It attacks conversion efficiency. Russia takes crude oil, converts that crude into fuel. It distributes the fuel. The military converts fuel into movement. Movement becomes operational power. Ukraine is trying to interfere at several points along that chain. And the more points that become vulnerable simultaneously, the harder it becomes for Russia to compensate. There is another important development. The pressure is not confined to land-based refineries. Russia's Black Sea energy infrastructure has also become increasingly exposed. In July, Ukrainian attacks disrupted operations around major Russian-linked oil export infrastructure. Reuters reported that Caspian pipeline consortium loadings were down roughly 20% in July, while Turkey sharply reduced imports from Russian Black Sea ports amid the disruptions. This matters because Russia's energy system is not just a collection of refineries. It is a chain that extends all the way to ports and tankers. If a refinery is damaged, Russia can attempt to compensate elsewhere. If a port becomes unreliable, exports have to move differently. If maritime routes become dangerous, ships require additional precautions. And if those precautions become expensive enough, the cost of maintaining normal trade rises. This is the larger pattern. Ukraine does not need to destroy every component. It needs to create enough uncertainty and disruption that Russia is forced to continuously reorganize the system. And that is where the story moves from fuel to geography. Because there is one place where Russia's dependence on a limited number of logistical connections becomes especially clear. Crimea. The peninsula is strategically valuable. It is also geographically constrained. And that combination makes it one of the clearest examples of what happens when strategic depth stops being an abstract advantage and becomes a logistical liability. Crimea is where the theory becomes a physical problem. On a map, the peninsula looks enormous. But for a military logistics planner, what matters is not how large Crimea is. What matters is how many reliable routes connect it to everything else. And that number is much smaller. For Russia, Crimea has two principal overland connections to the rest of the occupied territories and Russia itself. The land corridor through occupied southern Ukraine, and the Kerch Strait connection linking Crimea with Russia's Krasnodar region. Ukrainian forces have increasingly targeted both. That makes Crimea a useful case study, because Ukraine does not have to occupy the peninsula to make it harder for Russia to use. It only has to interfere with the network that keeps the peninsula supplied. The campaign intensified dramatically in June. Ukrainian strikes damaged bridges around Khanhur and the Sivash area, attacked infrastructure around Kerch, struck the ferry crossing and fuel facilities, and hit the port of Kavkaz on the Russian side of the Kerch Strait. OSW assessed that these attacks were severely hampering fuel supplies to Crimea. Critical Threats reported that Russian authorities subsequently imposed fuel restrictions in Crimea, temporarily suspended ferry operations, shortened public transport schedules in Sevastopol, and introduced other conservation measures. That is what logistical pressure looks like before it becomes a military collapse. The system still functions, but it no longer functions normally, and that distinction matters. Imagine a highway. If the highway is destroyed, the logistics system stops. But if the highway remains open while traffic must constantly be rerouted around damaged bridges, checkpoints, ferry delays, and drone threats, the system has not stopped. It has become less efficient. That is exactly what Ukraine is trying to create. A logistics system where every shipment requires more planning. Every route carries more risk. Every alternative requires more resources. And every replacement route becomes another potential target. This is particularly important because Crimea is not merely a civilian region. For Russia, it is a military platform. It hosts airfields, naval infrastructure, air defense systems, radar installations, storage facilities, and forces supporting operations across southern Ukraine. That means the question is not simply, can civilians in Crimea get gasoline? The military question is, can Russia reliably move enough fuel, ammunition, equipment, and personnel into Crimea to keep using it as a major military base? Those are two different thresholds. A shortage at a filling station does not automatically mean a shortage for the Russian military. Military logistics can be prioritized. Civilian consumption can be reduced. Supplies can be diverted. The state can ration scarce resources. But those decisions have consequences. If civilian consumption is restricted so that military requirements can be met, the military may continue operating while the civilian economy absorbs more of the pain. If military supplies are reduced to preserve civilian stability, the battlefield pays the price. Either way, the shortage becomes a resource allocation problem. And that is exactly what a successful interdiction campaign is supposed to create. The situation became even more complicated when Russia had to rely increasingly on maritime logistics. The Kerch Strait is not simply a geographical feature. It is a logistical gateway. If trucks cannot reliably cross one route, Russia needs another. If rail connections are disrupted, ferries become more important. If ferries become vulnerable, tankers become more important. And if tankers become targets, Russia faces a new problem. The alternative route has become another battlefield. British intelligence assessed in June that Ukrainian strikes disabling 3 car ferries had almost certainly worsened already mounting supply problems in Crimea, while severe fuel shortages and delays at crossing points were reported on the peninsula. By July, Ukrainian forces were increasingly targeting vessels involved in that maritime supply chain. Critical Threats reported Ukrainian claims that 13 vessels, including 10 tankers, were struck around occupied Crimea during the night of July 9th to 10th, while satellite fire detection data showed heat anomalies consistent with strikes in the Sea of Azov. The exact number and identities of damaged vessels require careful attribution. But the broader pattern is clear. The maritime alternative itself was becoming contested. That is a major change, because Russia's response to one vulnerability was to move more of the logistics burden onto another route. Ukraine then expanded the target set to that route. This is the adaptation loop in its clearest form. Russia does not need to lose every route. It needs only one reliable route to keep the system alive. Ukraine, therefore, does not need to destroy every route either. It needs to make the alternatives increasingly costly and uncertain. That is why the campaign has also targeted Russian air defenses. This may seem like a separate issue. It is not. Air defense protects the logistics network. If a refinery is protected, it is harder to strike. If a port is protected, ships are safer. If a tanker route is protected by surveillance and air defense systems, Ukraine has fewer opportunities to attack it. So before Ukraine can repeatedly strike logistics, it also needs to create openings in the defensive network. According to Ukraine's Unmanned Systems Commander Robert Brovdy, Ukrainian operations in Crimea have deliberately combined attacks on air defense systems with strikes on logistics, fuel, and energy infrastructure. AP reported that Russian forces have responded with increased drone deployments and electronic warfare measures. That is another reason the campaign should not be understood as simply, drone hits tanker. The real sequence is closer to find the defensive network, degrade the defensive network, identify the logistical dependency, strike the dependency, force Russia onto an alternative, identify the new dependency. Repeat, that is a much more sophisticated contest, and it explains why Crimea is so important. The peninsula has geography working against it. There are fewer routes. The routes are identifiable. Many of the most important connections converge around predictable locations, and Russia cannot simply move Crimea somewhere else, can only find another way to supply it. That makes the peninsula a laboratory for the larger strategic question. How much redundancy does Russia actually have? Because redundancy is what makes a large system resilient. If Russia has 5 independent ways to deliver fuel into Crimea, destroying one may accomplish very little. If Russia has 2, the same strike becomes much more important. And if the remaining route is vulnerable to the same type of attack, the problem becomes cumulative. This is why the phrase cutting Crimea off can be misleading. It implies a binary condition, connected or disconnected. Real logistics rarely work that way. There is a spectrum, fully supplied, partially supplied, delayed, rerouted, restricted, prioritized, expensive, and eventually unsustainable. Ukraine's objective appears to be moving Crimea along that spectrum, not necessarily severing every connection in one dramatic attack, but gradually making the peninsula more difficult and expensive to sustain. By July, reporting described shortages of fuel, electricity, and other essentials across Crimea, while Ukrainian officials openly described their strategy as an attempt to render the peninsula increasingly unusable as a Russian military base. But there is a crucial limitation. Russia can adapt, can protect routes, can move supplies at different times, can repair bridges, can use alternate roads, can deploy more electronic warfare, it can increase air defense coverage, and it can use naval and maritime routes when land routes become dangerous. So the real contest is not whether Ukraine can create a temporary shortage. It is whether Ukraine can maintain enough pressure that every Russian workaround becomes another problem to solve. That is the adaptation trap, and Crimea shows why it matters. Russia's problem is not that it has no route into Crimea. This problem is that every route now has to be treated as part of an active battlefield. And once logistics itself becomes a battlefield, the cost of maintaining the same military position begins to rise. The next question, therefore, is the most important one. What happens when Russia successfully adapts, but Ukraine simply attacks the adaptation? The first mistake in understanding this war is to imagine that a successful strike ends the story. It does not. A refinery burns. A railway is damaged. A tanker is hit. A bridge is closed. Then the defender responds. Repairs begin. Routes change. Supplies are redistributed. Air defenses move. Electronic warfare systems are deployed. New protective measures appear. And from the defender's perspective, that is exactly what resilience is supposed to look like. The system absorbs the blow. The system changes. The system continues. For Russia, this ability to adapt is one of its greatest advantages. The country has enormous territory, a large industrial base, multiple transportation networks, substantial energy resources, and years of experience operating under sanctions and wartime pressure. That means Ukraine cannot realistically expect every successful strike to produce a permanent reduction in Russian military capacity. Instead, the strategic question is whether the cost of adaptation itself can become significant. This is where the concept of an adaptation trap becomes useful. Imagine a military system with 3 layers. The first layer is the original system. The second is the replacement system created after the original system is damaged. And the third is the protection required to keep that replacement system alive. The defender may successfully move from layer 1 to layer 2. But layer 2 may be more expensive. And once the attacker discovers layer 2, the defender may have to build layer 3. That is not collapse. It is something subtler. The system survives, but becomes less efficient. Consider Crimea. If a railway is disrupted, Russia can use roads. If roads become vulnerable, it can use ferries. If ferries become vulnerable, it can use ships. If ships become vulnerable, it can increase protection. But protection requires equipment.
Surveillance.
Electronic warfare. Air defense.
Personnel.
And time. None of those resources are infinite. The same logic applies to Russia's energy infrastructure. If one refinery is damaged, another can increase production. But that refinery now has less spare capacity. If a second refinery is damaged, the remaining facilities have to compensate again. Eventually, the question changes from, can Russia replace this refinery's output? To, how much spare capacity does Russia have left after replacing everything else? That is a very different calculation. This is why aggregate damage can sometimes matter more than individual destruction. A single strike may be insignificant. A sequence of strikes can alter the operating conditions of the entire network. And there is evidence that Russia has been forced to make precisely these kinds of adjustments. Fuel export restrictions were expanded as domestic shortages became more serious. Refineries underwent emergency repairs. Fuel was redirected toward affected regions. Additional protection was deployed around vulnerable infrastructure. Maritime transport patterns also changed as attacks increased. Reuters reported that Russia's government repeatedly extended export restrictions in response to pressure on the domestic fuel market. Reuters.com. Again, none of this means Russia is running out of options. It means Russia is using its options. And that is precisely what Ukraine wants to force, because every option has an opportunity cost. A tanker carrying fuel to Crimea cannot simultaneously carry something somewhere else. An air defense system protecting a refinery cannot protect another facility at the same time. A repair team working on one refinery cannot repair another. A railway operating under military priority cannot provide unlimited capacity to civilian commerce. A government that restricts exports to protect domestic consumers sacrifices some foreign market flexibility. The system does not simply lose resources. It has to choose where those resources go. And war is fundamentally a contest over those choices. This becomes particularly important when the attacker has a lower-cost method of creating uncertainty. Drones are not free, but many long-range one-way attack drones are considerably cheaper than the infrastructure they threaten. That does not mean every drone strike is automatically cost-effective. A cheap drone that hits an irrelevant target may accomplish very little. The calculation changes when a relatively inexpensive weapon forces the defender to deploy much more expensive defenses or creates a prolonged repair problem. This is one reason Russian forces have invested heavily in electronic warfare, short-range air defenses, physical barriers, camouflage, dispersal, and other protective measures around critical facilities. These adaptations can reduce the probability of successful strikes, but they also consume resources. And the geographical scale of Russia creates an enormous coverage problem. A refinery is only one location. Russia has many. Port is one location. There are many. A rail junction is one location. There are thousands of kilometers of railway. The defender therefore faces an asymmetry. The attacker can search for vulnerabilities. The defender has to decide which vulnerabilities are worth protecting. This does not guarantee that Ukraine wins that competition. It simply changes the nature of the competition. The attacker is looking for nodes. The defender is trying to create redundancy. The attacker wants to reduce the number of reliable routes. The defender wants to increase them. The attacker wants every replacement to remain vulnerable. The defender wants every replacement to be sufficiently protected. And both sides are learning continuously. That learning process is what makes the war so difficult to reduce to a simple list of victories and defeats. A strike may be successful tactically but fail operationally. A refinery may be damaged but repaired before the military feels a meaningful shortage. A bridge may be disabled but replaced by a ferry. A ferry may be attacked but replaced by a tanker. A tanker may be protected by electronic warfare. And the cycle continues. This is why conversion matters. The military value of an attack is not determined by the explosion. It is determined by what happens afterward. Did the attack reduce military output? Did it delay a shipment? Did it force the enemy to reroute? Did it consume scarce air defense ammunition? Did it require additional personnel? Did it increase transportation costs? Did it force the government to divert fuel? Did it reduce exports? Did it create a second vulnerability? The more of these effects accumulate, the greater the strategic value of the original strike. But there is another side to the equation. Russia is also learning. Every Ukrainian strike reveals information. Russia can identify which routes are being targeted, which facilities are vulnerable, which types of drones are being used, which approaches are difficult to detect, which infrastructure is most important to Ukraine. And Russia can respond, can move equipment, change schedules, deploy jammers, build physical protection, increase patrols, disperse assets, and sometimes simply accept that a particular facility is too difficult to defend and focus resources somewhere else. This creates a contest of adaptation. Ukraine is trying to find the point where Russian adaptation becomes expensive. Russia is trying to make Ukrainian adaptation expensive first. And that brings us to one of the most important misconceptions about drone warfare. It is tempting to think that because drones are cheap and numerous, they automatically give the attacker an advantage. They do not. The advantage comes from what the drones force the defender to do. If Russia can destroy most incoming drones cheaply, the attack campaign may produce limited strategic returns. If Russia must use expensive interceptors, redeploy scarce air defense systems, and continuously repair damaged infrastructure, the economic equation changes. But even then, the equation is not one-sided. Ukraine must manufacture drones, find targets, collect intelligence, maintain launch systems, develop navigation methods, adapt to Russian electronic warfare, and replace equipment that fails. So the same adaptation trap exists on both sides. Russia adapts to Ukrainian strikes. Ukraine adapts to Russian defenses. Russia changes the defenses. Ukraine changes the attack. And the cycle continues. This is why the war is increasingly becoming a contest of learning speed. Who identifies the other's new vulnerability first? Who can change faster? Who can manufacture the replacement faster? Who has more redundancy? Who can absorb failure without reducing military output? And perhaps most importantly, who can force the other side to spend more resources adapting than it can afford to spend? That is the strategic competition hiding underneath the individual drone strikes. And it explains why a map showing almost no movement can still conceal a rapidly changing war. The front line may move only a few kilometers, but behind it, the systems sustaining that front line are constantly being reorganized. The question is whether that reorganization is merely an inconvenience, or whether, over time, it becomes a structural burden. And before we can answer that, we have to confront an uncomfortable fact. Russia has been under enormous pressure before. It has repeatedly demonstrated an ability to absorb punishment. So if we want to understand whether this adaptation trap can actually matter, we have to examine the strongest argument against our own thesis. Russia may simply be able to keep adapting. There is a danger in telling this story too confidently. If Russia is being forced to reroute fuel, repair refineries, protect tankers, and redistribute air defenses, it is tempting to conclude that the system must be approaching collapse. But that conclusion goes too far. A system can become more expensive without becoming unsustainable. And Russia has several advantages that make it exceptionally difficult to break through economic pressure alone. The first is scale. Russia remains one of the world's largest energy producers. Its oil industry is enormous. Its territory provides redundancy. If one facility is damaged, there are others. If one route is disrupted, there are alternatives. If one region experiences shortages, the state can redirect supplies from elsewhere. That redundancy is exactly what strategic depth was designed to provide. The second advantage is industrial adaptation. Russia has spent years operating under sanctions. That experience has encouraged domestic substitution, alternative supply chains, and greater tolerance for economic disruption. Some components remain difficult to replace. Some repairs take longer. Some imports are restricted. But the Russian state has repeatedly demonstrated that it can reorganize around constraints rather than simply accept them. That matters because Ukraine's strategy depends on cumulative pressure. Cumulative pressure only works if the pressure accumulates faster than the defender can remove it. If Russia can repair a refinery before another strike creates a new shortage, the system may absorb the damage. If Russia can move fuel through another route before the original route becomes strategically important again, the disruption may remain temporary. And if Russian industry can replace damaged equipment faster than Ukraine can increase the frequency of attacks, the balance changes again. This is why one statistic can never tell the whole story. A refinery being offline is important, but how long it remains offline matters more. A railway being damaged is important, but how quickly traffic is restored matters more. A tanker being attacked is important, but whether Russia can replace that transport capacity matters more. In other words, the key variable is not simply damage. It is recovery time. That is one of the reasons Russia's enormous industrial base remains such a powerful asset. The country does not need every factory to operate perfectly. It only needs enough of the system to keep producing the military output required by the war. That is a much lower threshold. And there is another advantage. Russia does not have to solve every problem permanently. It only has to solve enough of them for long enough. A temporary fuel shortage can be managed. A temporary railway disruption can be bypassed. A temporary refinery shutdown can be compensated for. A temporary reduction in exports can be accepted. This is the logic of wartime resilience. The defender does not need to eliminate every vulnerability. It needs to prevent those vulnerabilities from becoming cumulative enough to reduce military effectiveness. and there is evidence that Russia continues to retain substantial military capacity. The country's missile and drone campaigns against Ukraine remain significant. Russian forces continue to apply pressure along the front, and Russia has continued adapting its own use of unmanned systems, electronic warfare, and strike capabilities. In other words, the same country experiencing fuel disruptions is still capable of generating enormous military pressure against Ukraine. That fact cannot be ignored, because if the Russian military can continue increasing or maintaining its battlefield output while absorbing attacks on its rear infrastructure, then the strategic effect of those attacks remains limited. This creates an uncomfortable possibility for Ukraine. It may be winning the efficiency contest without winning the capacity contest. Russia may become less efficient, but if Russia has enough capacity, lower efficiency may not matter immediately. Imagine two factories. Factory A produces 100 units at a cost of 10 per unit. After repeated disruptions, its cost rises to 15. That is a serious deterioration. But if Factory A can still produce 100 units, the military output has not changed. The defender is poorer. The system is less efficient. But the battlefield may look exactly the same. That is why the ultimate test is not economic pain. It is whether economic pain becomes military limitation. Can Russia still supply its forces? Can it still replace losses? Can it still launch missiles and drones? Can it still maintain armored units? Can it still repair damaged equipment? Can it still reinforce threatened sectors? Can it still sustain the war at its current intensity? If the answer remains yes, then Ukrainian long-range strikes are imposing costs, but not yet changing the fundamental balance. And this is where the concept of strategic depth returns. Russia's geography may be more difficult to defend than before, but it is still enormous. Ukraine can reach deeper than it once could. That does not mean Ukraine can reach everything. The defender still has more territory than the attacker can realistically monitor. It still has multiple industrial centers. It still has multiple ports. It still has multiple transportation routes. And it still has the ability to concentrate defensive resources around the facilities it considers most important. This creates another asymmetry. Ukraine has to decide where to strike. Russia has to decide where to defend. Neither side can cover everything. The outcome, therefore, depends heavily on intelligence. If Ukraine can identify a facility that Russia considers critical but poorly protected, a relatively small strike can produce disproportionate effects. If Russia identifies that vulnerability first and protects it, Ukraine may have to spend far more resources to achieve the same result. That is why the future of the campaign will not be determined simply by how many drones Ukraine possesses. It will depend on targeting quality, adaptation speed, and the ability to sustain repeated attacks. And this is where the Russian advantage becomes clearer. Russia has something Ukraine desperately needs: time. Not unlimited time, not cost-free time, but the ability to absorb disruption and continue fighting while adaptation takes place. That does not mean Russia is invulnerable. It means the threshold for strategic failure is high. And this is why claims that Russia's economy is about to collapse should be treated with caution. Fuel shortages can be real. Refinery disruptions can be serious. Export declines can be substantial. Crimea can face genuine logistical pressure. None of those facts automatically imply systemic collapse. The more defensible conclusion is narrower. Russia is being forced to spend more resources managing vulnerabilities that previously required less attention. That matters, but it only becomes strategically decisive if the pressure persists. And that creates a second problem. Ukraine must sustain the campaign while facing its own shortages and constraints. Because Russia is not the only side caught in an adaptation trap. Ukraine is inside one too, and understanding that side of the equation may be even more important than understanding Russia's vulnerabilities. There is another side to the equation that is easy to miss. Every time Ukraine forces Russia to adapt, Ukraine has to adapt as well. The long-range strike campaign may be putting pressure on Russian infrastructure, but maintaining that campaign requires intelligence, drones, operators, launch systems, electronic warfare capabilities, and a constant effort to stay ahead of Russian defenses. And unlike Russia, Ukraine does not have strategic depth measured in thousands of kilometers. Its critical infrastructure is much closer to the battlefield. The cities remain exposed. Its energy system remains under attack, and its air defense network has to protect a country that is fighting a much larger state. That creates a fundamental asymmetry. Russia has more territory to defend, but Ukraine has fewer layers of territory between its most important infrastructure and the Russian strike campaign. So while Ukrainian drones are reaching deep into Russia, Russian missiles and drones continue reaching deep into Ukraine. The two sides are therefore fighting two different versions of the same war. Ukraine is trying to make Russia's rear increasingly expensive to defend. Russia is trying to make Ukraine's rear increasingly difficult to sustain. And both strategies depend on the same underlying question. How much can the system absorb before military output begins to fall? For Ukraine, one of the most important constraints is air defense. A country can build more drones relatively quickly. But protecting cities and critical infrastructure against ballistic missiles is a different problem. The interceptors are expensive, the systems are limited, and the geographic area that needs protection is enormous. This creates a difficult resource allocation problem. Should Ukraine concentrate air defenses around major cities, military headquarters, power plants, factories, ports, air bases, railway hubs? There is no perfect answer. Every battery placed in one location is a battery unavailable somewhere else. And Russia understands that. The same logic applies to manpower. Ukraine's ability to conduct long-range strikes does not eliminate the need for soldiers on the front. Drones can find targets. They can attack logistics. They can disrupt infrastructure. But they cannot completely replace infantry holding terrain. They cannot permanently occupy a city. And they cannot remove the fundamental requirement to maintain a functioning army. That means Ukraine has to divide scarce resources between two very different campaigns. One is defensive, survive Russian attacks and hold the front. The other is offensive, reach deeper into Russia and impose costs on the system behind the front. Both consume resources, and the better one strategy performs, the more the other may demand. A successful Ukrainian strike campaign can force Russia to move air defenses away from the front to protect infrastructure inside Russia. That is useful. But Ukraine also needs those same kinds of defensive systems to protect itself. A successful Russian missile campaign can force Ukraine to deploy more air defenses around cities. That protects civilians. But those systems cannot simultaneously support the offensive effort. This is what makes the conflict increasingly resemble a competition over resource allocation rather than simple destruction. Each side is trying to create dilemmas the other side cannot solve everywhere at once. And Ukraine faces another constraint that Russia does not face to the same degree: dependence on external support. Ukraine's ability to sustain high-intensity warfare depends heavily on foreign ammunition, air defense systems, intelligence, financial support, and military technology. That does not make Ukraine powerless. In some areas, Ukraine has demonstrated remarkable ability to innovate domestically, particularly in unmanned systems. But innovation does not eliminate industrial constraints. A drone campaign still requires components. Components require supply chains. Supply chains require money. Money requires continued economic and political support. And advanced air defense systems cannot simply be manufactured overnight. This is why the Ukrainian long-range campaign has to be judged over time. If Ukraine can repeatedly strike Russian infrastructure without exhausting its own drone production, intelligence network, and personnel, then the pressure can accumulate. But if Russia improves its defenses faster than Ukraine improves its attacks, the cost-benefit equation changes. The same is true for Crimea. Ukraine can disrupt a railway. Russia repairs it. Ukraine attacks a ferry. Russia shifts to another route.
Ukraine target à ton cœur.
Russia increases protection. At each stage, Ukraine has to develop the next method. That means the attacker is also caught in an adaptation trap. There is another complication. Russia can respond asymmetrically. It does not have to defend every refinery. It can attack Ukrainian infrastructure instead. It can target power generation, transportation, industrial facilities, military bases, ports, and civilian infrastructure. That means every Ukrainian attempt to increase Russian costs can trigger another Russian attempt to increase Ukrainian costs. The war therefore becomes a contest of relative resilience. Not who can avoid damage. Neither side can. But who can continue producing military power despite the damage? This is a much harder question. Suppose Ukraine damages a Russian refinery. Russia loses some refining capacity, but Ukraine simultaneously loses a power plant. Which side is more affected? The answer depends on the broader system. How much spare capacity exists? How quickly can each side repair? Can alternative routes compensate? Does the damage affect civilian life? Does it affect military logistics? Does it force the government to divert resources? Does it change battlefield decisions? This is why the physical size of the explosion is a poor measure of strategic importance. A small strike can have enormous consequences if it hits a critical node. A spectacular explosion can have almost no lasting effect if the system has redundancy. The same principle applies to Russian attacks on Ukraine. Destroying a transformer is one thing. Creating a prolonged electricity shortage during winter is another. Damaging a railway line is one thing. Disrupting the movement of ammunition for several weeks is another. The strategic effect comes from duration and dependency. And this brings us back to the central thesis. Ukraine does not need Russia to collapse. It needs Russia to become less efficient. But Ukraine itself cannot become dramatically less efficient at the same time. If Ukrainian losses, shortages, and defensive requirements increase faster than Russian adaptation costs, then the strategy loses its advantage. That is the danger. The long-range campaign could impose real damage on Russia while failing to produce a decisive military effect. It could force Moscow to spend more money, deploy more defenses, and accept higher fuel costs, while the front line continues moving very slowly. That would still matter, but it would be a war of attrition, not a breakthrough. And this is perhaps the most important distinction in the entire story. The question is not whether Ukraine has found a way to hurt Russia. It clearly has. The question is whether those attacks can be converted into something larger. A sustained reduction in Russia's ability to generate military power. That conversion is difficult. It requires repeated attacks, accurate intelligence, reliable production, survivable launch systems, continual adaptation, and time. And time is precisely what both sides are fighting for. Russia wants enough time for its defenses, industry, and logistics to adapt. Ukraine wants enough time for cumulative disruption to become harder and harder to reverse. That is why the next phase of this war may be decided far away from any single battlefield. Not by one refinery, not by one bridge, not by one drone swarm, but by the ability of two enormous military systems to absorb disruption and keep producing the same thing. Usable military power. And that brings us to the real metric. Not destruction, not headlines, not even territory. Conversion efficiency. How much military power can each side still generate from every unit of resource it has left? The most important mistake in measuring this war may be measuring the wrong thing. A damaged refinery is visible. A destroyed warehouse is visible. A burning tanker is visible. But none of those images tells us by themselves whether the attack was strategically important. The harder question is what happened afterward. Did Russia lose military output? Did it have to redirect fuel? Did another refinery have to compensate? Did air defenses have to be moved? Did repairs take weeks or months? Did transportation costs rise? Did the government have to divert resources away from something else? That is the real measurement. Call it conversion efficiency. A military system takes resources and converts them into usable military power. Money becomes ammunition. Fuel becomes movement. Industrial capacity becomes weapons. Infrastructure becomes logistics. Intelligence becomes targeting. Personnel become combat power. The question is not whether Ukraine can damage those inputs. It can. The question is whether the damage reduces the amount of military power Russia can actually generate. That distinction explains why the war can look contradictory. Russia can experience serious fuel shortages while continuing to attack Ukraine. Ukraine can destroy important Russian infrastructure while still struggling to protect its own cities from ballistic missiles. Both statements can be true at the same time. The reason is that military systems contain buffers. They have stockpiles, alternative suppliers, spare capacity, emergency measures, priorities, and time. A refinery can go offline without immediately changing the number of Russian artillery rounds fired that week. A damaged railway can be bypassed without stopping an army. A tanker can be destroyed without eliminating maritime logistics. The strategic effect only emerges when the disruption exceeds the system's ability to compensate. That creates a sequence we can use to evaluate every major strike. Damage, disruption, adaptation, cost, military effect. The first step is easy to observe. The second requires evidence. The third requires understanding what the defender did. The fourth requires measuring what those adaptations consumed. And the fifth is the hardest of all. Because ultimately, the question is whether the military can still do what it was trying to do. Take the Russian fuel situation. By August 2026, Ukrainian attacks had helped create serious disruptions in several Russian regions. Reuters reported that the Orsk refinery was shut down after a strike, and that only about 80% of the region's filling stations were operating. Repairs could take months because key equipment was difficult to replace. That is a meaningful effect, but it does not automatically mean Russian armored formations ran out of fuel. The military receives priority. The state can redirect supplies. Civilian consumption can be restricted. Exports can be reduced. And the system can absorb part of the shock. So the correct conclusion is not, Russia is running out of fuel. It is, Russia is increasingly spending resources to preserve fuel availability under sustained disruption. That is less dramatic. It is also more useful. The same logic applies to air defense. A Ukrainian drone may be destroyed before reaching its target. That can look like a Russian defensive victory, and tactically it is. But if defending every refinery requires additional radar coverage, electronic warfare, short-range air defenses, interceptor drones and personnel, then the cost of defense becomes part of the strategic equation. The opposite is also true. If Ukraine has to use increasingly sophisticated drones to penetrate those defenses, the cost of the offensive campaign rises as well. So the relevant calculation is not simply drone versus air defense missile. It is cost of attack versus cost of defense, multiplied by frequency, multiplied by duration, with the consequences of a successful strike added to the equation. That is much harder to measure, and it changes the way we should understand the entire campaign. A cheap drone is not automatically strategically efficient. A costly interceptor is not automatically strategically inefficient. What matters is what each side is forced to do repeatedly. Suppose Ukraine spends $1 million conducting an attack. Russia spends several $million defending against it. That may favor Ukraine. But suppose Russia then changes its defenses and Ukraine needs much more expensive weapons to achieve the same penetration. The balance can shift again. And that is why the contest keeps moving. Neither side is fighting against a fixed system. They are fighting against a system that learns. Russia changes its air defenses. Ukraine changes its drones. Russia changes its transportation routes. Ukraine changes its target set. Ukraine increases attacks on Russian logistics. Russia disperses supplies. Ukraine searches for the nodes that remain concentrated. This is not a one-time advantage. It is a repeated competition over adaptation. And that produces the deeper strategic question. Can Ukraine make adaptation itself the source of Russian weakness? Because if every workaround creates a new vulnerability, then the cost does not remain attached to the original strike. It spreads. The refinery problem becomes a transportation problem. The transportation problem becomes a fuel price problem. The fuel price problem becomes a government management problem. The government management problem creates political pressure. But here we need to be careful. That last step is the least certain. Economic pressure does not automatically become political instability. Population can tolerate shortages. A government can suppress discontent. A wartime economy can prioritize military requirements over civilian comfort. So we should not assume that a fuel crisis automatically translates into regime crisis. The stronger argument is narrower. Every additional problem creates another demand on the state's capacity to manage the war. And state capacity is not infinite. That is the real significance of long-range strikes. They may be creating what could be called a coordination tax on Russia's war effort. More facilities require protection. More routes require monitoring. More repairs require planning. More scarce resources have to be prioritized. More alternatives have to be coordinated. The attack, therefore, does not need to destroy the entire system. It only needs to make the system increasingly expensive to operate. But even that has a limit. Russia can absorb considerable inefficiency if its underlying capacity remains large enough. And Ukraine faces the same constraint. Its campaign only becomes strategically decisive if it can sustain the pressure long enough for these costs to accumulate. That is why the real metric is neither the number of drones launched nor the number of facilities hit. It is the rate at which each side can replace the capability that the other side disrupts. If Russia repairs faster than Ukraine can damage, Russia wins that exchange. If Ukraine damages faster than Russia can restore, the pressure accumulates. If both rates remain roughly balanced, the result is another form of attrition. And that may be the most accurate description of where the war stands. The battlefield is not frozen, but its transformation is not necessarily happening through dramatic territorial breakthroughs. It is happening through a slower contest. Can one side force the other to consume more resources to maintain the same military output? That is why the refinery, the railway, the tanker, and the air defense battery all belong in the same story. They are different components of one competition. And that competition is about to become even harder for Ukraine. Because Russia is not its only constraint. By this point, the pattern should be clear. Ukraine has developed a way to reach deep into Russia. Those strikes are creating real disruptions. Fuel shortages have spread across parts of Russia. Transport costs have risen. Refineries have been forced offline. And the pressure is increasingly reaching systems far from the battlefield. Reuters reported that Ukrainian drone strikes on Russian oil infrastructure were contributing to fuel shortages and sharply higher trucking costs, with freight rates rising substantially in July. At the same time, Ukraine's campaign against Crimea is becoming more systematic. Ukrainian officials describe the objective as making the peninsula increasingly difficult to use as a Russian military base by attacking railways, oil depots, energy infrastructure, and air defense systems. Russia, meanwhile, is responding with more drones, electronic warfare, and other protective measures. So something has clearly changed. But what exactly? There are three ways this war could develop from here. The first is the simplest. Russia absorbs the cost. Moscow improves its defenses. Refineries recover. Alternative transportation routes become more reliable. Fuel supplies stabilize. Air defense coverage expands. And Russian industry learns to operate under continuous disruption. If that happens, Ukraine's deep strike campaign remains painful but limited. It becomes another component of a long war of attrition. Russia spends more, but it continues producing enough military power to keep fighting. The second possibility is very different. Ukraine sustains the pressure. Instead of allowing damaged infrastructure to return fully to normal before the next disruption arrives, Ukraine repeatedly attacks the same broad systems. A refinery is repaired. Another one is hit. A railway is restored. A bridge or transfer point becomes the next target. A maritime route replaces the land connection. The maritime route becomes contested. Russia improves protection. Ukraine improves its penetration methods. And the accumulated burden becomes harder to reverse. This is where the adaptation trap becomes strategically important. The question would no longer be whether any individual strike is decisive. It would be whether Russia can keep restoring the same level of military output while continuously rebuilding the systems behind it. There is already evidence that the pressure is not purely theoretical. In August, Russian authorities were still dealing with fuel shortages and elevated transportation costs, while the Orsk refinery remained offline after a Ukrainian strike and was expected to require months of repair. But the third possibility may be the most realistic. Both sides adapt. Russia improves its defenses. Ukraine improves its drones. Russia changes logistics. Ukraine changes its targets. Russia disperses infrastructure. Ukraine searches for concentrated dependencies. Russia attacks Ukrainian cities and industrial facilities. Ukraine attacks Russian energy and logistics infrastructure. And neither side obtains a decisive breakthrough. This is what a mature drone-centric war can look like. Not a series of spectacular victories. A continuous competition in which every advantage generates a countermeasure. And the importance of that competition becomes clearer when we look at the other side of the battlefield. While Ukrainian drones strike deep inside Russia, Russian long-range attacks continue to impose enormous costs on Ukraine. The United Nations reported that at least 437 civilians were killed and 2,610 injured in Ukraine during July 2026, making it the country's deadliest month for civilians since May 2022. Long-range missiles and drones were major contributors, while Ukraine continued to face shortages of Patriot air defense interceptors. That fact prevents the story from becoming too simple. Ukraine may be increasing the cost of Russia's rear area security, but Russia is still capable of attacking Ukraine's rear. It is still striking cities. It is still damaging infrastructure. It is still attempting to degrade Ukraine's industrial and logistical capacity. And that means both sides are playing the same strategic game from opposite directions. Make the enemy spend more to keep functioning. Russia attempts to impose that burden on Ukraine through missile and drone attacks. Ukraine attempts to impose it on Russia through long-range strikes against energy, logistics, and military infrastructure. The difference lies in what each side can afford to lose. Ukraine has less territory. Russia has more industrial depth. Ukraine has developed a powerful domestic drone industry. Russia retains a much larger resource and manufacturing base. Ukraine depends heavily on external military support. Russia is increasingly dependent on adaptation to sanctions, alternative trade networks, and continued mobilization of domestic resources. So the contest is not simply about who has the better drone. It is about which system can sustain its adaptation cycle longer. And that is why the next stage of the war may look confusing on a conventional map. You might see a front line that has barely moved. And yet the underlying military system could be changing rapidly. Refineries are being repaired in different ways. Routes are being rerouted. Air defenses are being repositioned. Drones are becoming harder to intercept. Electronic warfare is evolving. Production is being dispersed. And infrastructure that once existed safely in the rear is being treated as part of the battlefield. This is the deeper transformation. The war is expanding without necessarily expanding geographically at the front. It is expanding through connectivity. A refinery in central Russia can now affect a trucking company thousands of kilometers away. A damaged rail connection in southern Russia can affect Crimea. A tanker in the Black Sea can become part of a land war. An air defense battery protecting a refinery can no longer be considered purely defensive. It is also a military resource being diverted from somewhere else. The boundaries between battlefield, economy, and infrastructure are becoming harder to separate. But there is still a critical test that Ukraine has not yet conclusively passed. Disruption is not the same thing as strategic paralysis. Russia can suffer serious shortages and continue fighting. Ukraine can suffer enormous attacks and continue fighting. Both sides have demonstrated resilience, so the decisive question remains unresolved. Can either side push the other's adaptation costs across a threshold where military output actually falls? That is the threshold to watch. Not the next burning refinery, not the next destroyed warehouse, not the next viral satellite image. The real signal will be whether those attacks begin producing measurable changes in force generation, logistics throughput, ammunition availability, repair capacity, air defense coverage, and offensive tempo. Those are the indicators that would show the war is moving from disruption toward strategic effect. And there is one final reason to be cautious. Ukraine's strategy requires time. The longer the campaign continues, the more opportunities Ukraine has to find vulnerabilities. But the longer the war continues, the more opportunities Russia has to adapt to them. At the same time, Ukraine must preserve its own ability to fight. Its air defenses must survive. Its manpower must hold. Its industrial base must function. Its allies must continue supplying critical capabilities. And its long-range strike campaign must remain sustainable. So the future of this war may depend less on whether Ukraine can reach Russia. It already can. The harder question is whether Ukraine can make those strikes compound faster than Russia can absorb them. If it can, strategic depth may gradually lose some of its traditional value. If it cannot, Russia's enormous territory may remain exactly what it has always been, a buffer with enough redundancy to absorb punishment. And that brings us back to the paradox at the center of the war. Russia's strategic depth once meant that the further you moved from the front, the safer the system became. Now the further the war reaches, the more infrastructure Russia has to defend. That does not mean strategic depth has disappeared. It means strategic depth now carries a cost. And that cost may become one of the most important variables in determining how this war evolves. Russia's greatest geographic advantage has always been distance. Distance gives a military time. Time to move factories. Time to rebuild railways. Time to gather reserves. Time to retreat. Time to replace losses. And time to absorb an attack without immediately losing the war. That advantage still exists. Ukraine has not somehow erased the size of Russia. It has not made every Russian refinery vulnerable. It has not destroyed every logistics route. And it has not demonstrated that long-range strikes alone can force Moscow to abandon the war. But something important has changed. The Russian rear can no longer be treated as a simple space beyond the battlefield. It is becoming part of the battlefield itself. A refinery can affect fuel availability. Fuel availability affects transportation. Transportation affects logistics. Logistics affects military operations. Air defenses protect all of these systems, but those air defenses are themselves limited resources. And when one part of the network is attacked, Russia has to decide how much it is willing to spend to restore it. That is the real significance of Ukraine's deep strike campaign. Not that every strike is decisive. Not that Russia is on the verge of collapse. But that the cost of maintaining the same military system may be rising. And that creates the central question we began with. Can Ukraine turn Russia's strategic depth from an advantage into a liability? The answer is not yet yes. But neither is it simply no. Russia still has enormous reserves of territory, industry, manpower, and resources. Its ability to adapt remains one of its greatest strengths. Ukraine therefore faces an extremely difficult task. It must transform repeated tactical successes into sustained operational disruption, and then transform that disruption into a measurable reduction in Russia's ability to generate military power. That requires more than explosions. It requires persistence, targeting, intelligence, production, and time. Russia faces the opposite problem. The system may continue functioning, but every additional layer of protection, every rerouted shipment, every emergency repair, and every alternative supply route carries a cost. The question is whether those costs remain manageable. That is why the most important image of this war may not be a destroyed refinery or a burning tanker. It may be a logistics map filled with increasingly complicated arrows. Because those arrows represent choices. Routes that have to be changed. Facilities that have to be protected. Resources that have to be redirected. and a state constantly deciding what it can afford to defend. Strategic depth is still an advantage. But an advantage is only useful if the system can afford to exploit it. And that may be the deeper paradox of Russia's geography. The more space Russia has, the more space it can use to survive. But the more interconnected infrastructure that space contains, the more there is to defend. Ukraine does not need to destroy all of it. It needs to make the network increasingly expensive to maintain. Russia does not need to make every target invulnerable. It needs to keep enough of the network functioning. And between those two objectives lies the next phase of the war. Not a simple race to destroy, a race to adapt, a race to repair, a race to replace, and above all, a race to determine which side can continue converting its remaining resources into usable military power more efficiently than the other. That is why the front line alone can no longer tell the whole story. The war is being fought there, but it is also being fought on railways, in refineries, around ports, inside air defense networks, across supply chains and thousands of kilometers behind the trenches. The battlefield has not disappeared. It has expanded, and Russia's strategic depth may no longer be simply the shield it once was. It may also be the bill that eventually has to be paid.